Welcome to the HOA Fallout channel. I am Michael Vincent, and today I am going to tell you a story about wand, greed, and the price of silence. A young woman inherited 3,200 acres from her grandfather, only to discover that someone had been drilling for oil on her property without her knowledge. If you enjoy stories about justice and legal drama, do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from today. And the story begins like this. This story was sent to our channel by the woman who lived through it. Her name is Eleanor Hartwell, and she asked us to share her experience in her own words. So, here it is, exactly as she told it to us. Monday morning, I was the first person waiting at the door of the Midland County Clerk's office when the lights inside flickered on. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain, gave me a curious look as she unlocked the entrance. I told her I needed to review all oil and gas leases filed in the county within the past 12 months, specifically anything involving the property boundaries near my grandfather's ranch. She asked if I was an attorney. I said no, I was the landowner. She raised an eyebrow but led me to a back room filled with filing cabinets and computer terminals, explaining that the most recent records had been digitized, but some older documents still required manual searching. I thanked her and got to work. It took me 3 hours to find what I was looking for, and when I did, my stomach dropped. The lease agreement was dated March 15th of this year, exactly 3 months before my grandfather passed away from a heart attack. The document authorized Apex Petroleum to conduct exploratory drilling and extraction operations on a parcel of land described in extensive legal language, with coordinates and boundary markers that I cross-referenced against the county's official plat maps. The parcel included my grandfather's 3,200 acres, but the signature at the bottom of the lease did not belong to Walter Hartwell. It belonged to someone named Garrett Thornton, identified as president of the Permian Ridge Community Association, acting on behalf of affected landowners within the association's designated service area. There was a second signature as well, Craig Bellows, listed as secretary and legal counsel. I had never heard of either of these men, and I knew for certain that my grandfather had never been a member of any homeowners association. He had lived on that land for over 60 years, fiercely independent, answering to no one. I made copies of every document I could find, the lease agreement, the boundary descriptions, the permit applications filed with the Texas Railroad Commission. Then I drove into town, to a small office building on Main Street, with a sign out front that read Permian Ridge Community Association. The reception area was modest but professional, with framed photographs of local landmarks on the walls and a young woman behind the front desk who smiled politely and asked if I had an appointment. I said I did not, but I was hoping to speak with Mr. Thornton about a property matter. She made a phone call, spoke in low tones, and then told me to have a seat. 10 minutes later, a door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, maybe 6'2", with silver hair and a deep tan that spoke of decades under the Texas sun. He wore a Western-style dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and when he smiled, it was the kind of smile that had probably charmed 1,000 handshakes over the years. But he positioned himself between me and the hallway before gesturing toward his office, a subtle control of the space that felt less like hospitality and more like herding. He introduced himself as Garrett Thornton and invited me to sit with the warmth of a politician greeting a constituent. The office was larger than I expected, with a mahogany desk, leather chairs, and a window overlooking the parking lot. On the wall behind his desk hung a framed map of the region, with certain areas highlighted in yellow. I noticed that my grandfather's land was among them. Garrett settled into his chair and asked what he could do for me. I kept my voice calm and professional, the same tone I used when interviewing executives about suspicious transactions. I told him my name was Eleanor Hartwell, that I had recently inherited my grandfather's property, and that I had discovered drilling operations on the land that I had not authorized. I asked him to explain how the Permian Ridge Community Association had signed a lease agreement on behalf of a landowner who was never a member. Garrett's smile did not waver, but he leaned back slowly, folding his hands across his stomach in a posture that seemed designed to make me wait. He spoke like a patient teacher addressing a confused student. He explained that the association had been working for years to bring economic development to the region, and that the oil lease with Apex Petroleum represented a tremendous opportunity for all residents. He acknowledged that my grandfather had never formally joined the association, but noted that his property fell within the boundaries of the community's designated service area. According to Texas Property Code Section 202, he said, associations have authority to act on behalf of properties within their service boundaries under certain circumstances, particularly when landowners fail to respond to proper notification. He waved his hand vaguely as he said this, as though the specifics were too tedious to explain. He mentioned that notices had been sent to my grandfather, though he did not say how many, or when, or by what method of delivery. When I asked to see copies of those notifications, his answer came a half-second too fast. I should submit a formal request through the association's legal counsel, Mr. Craig Bellows, who would be happy to assist me. Then he stood, signaling that our meeting was over. As I walked toward the door, Garrett spoke again, his voice carrying a different edge now. He said that the community had worked hard to build something beneficial for everyone, and that it would be unfortunate if one person's misunderstanding created problems for the many families who depended on the revenue from this project. He said he hoped I would take some time to consider the bigger picture before making any decisions I might regret. I did not respond. I simply nodded and walked out through the reception area, feeling the eyes of the young woman at the desk following me as I left. Outside, the midday sun was brutal, and I stood by my car for a moment, letting the heat wash over me. That was when I noticed a black pickup truck parked 2 spaces away that had not been there when I arrived. The driver, a heavy-set man in sunglasses, stared at me for a long moment before starting his engine and pulling away. I memorized the license plate. I was halfway back to the ranch when my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The words on the screen were simple and direct. Some things are better left buried, like your grandfather. I pulled over to the side of the road and sat there, reading the message twice. Then I took a screenshot, noted the time and the phone number, and saved everything to a secure folder. Garrett Thornton had quoted Texas law like he had written it himself. He had smiled like a man who had never lost a negotiation. But he had made one mistake. He had assumed I was just a grieving granddaughter, out of her depth, easily intimidated. He did not know that I had spent 10 years tracing money through shell companies and forged documents. And he certainly did not know that the numbers in those lease agreements were already telling me a story of fraud, manipulation, and theft. The only question now was whether there was any way out of this trap they had built, or whether they had already sealed every exit. 3 days after my meeting with Garrett Thornton, a certified letter arrived at my grandfather's ranch. The envelope bore the return address of the Permian Ridge Community Association, and inside was a document titled Notice of Special Assessment. According to the letter, as a property owner within the association's designated service area, I was required to pay $47,000 to fund community infrastructure development related to the oil extraction project. The payment was due within 30 days. Failure to comply would result in a lien being placed on my property, which could eventually lead to foreclosure proceedings. I read the letter twice, then set it down on my grandfather's desk. They were not just stealing from me. They were trying to force me to pay for the privilege of being robbed. I needed groceries, so I drove into town that afternoon to the same small supermarket where my grandfather had shopped for decades. The parking lot was half full, and I recognized a few faces as I walked through the automatic doors. People I had seen at my grandfather's funeral, neighbors who had brought casseroles and offered condolences. But something had changed. A woman I remembered from the church service glanced at me and quickly looked away, pushing her cart in the opposite direction. 2 men near the produce section fell silent as I approached. I could feel eyes following me through the aisles, and I caught fragments of whispers that were not quite quiet enough. Granddaughter, causing trouble. I kept my expression neutral and focused on my shopping list, but the message was clear. Word had spread, and the community had already chosen a side. At the checkout counter, the cashier, a young woman with a name tag that read Brenda, scanned my items without making eye contact. But as she handed me my receipt, she paused. She said she had heard I was trying to stop the oil project. She said a lot of families in this town were counting on that money. Her voice was not angry exactly. It was something worse. It was righteous, as though she had already decided I was the villain in a story she had heard secondhand. I took my bags and left without responding. There was nothing I could say that would matter. I sat in my car in the parking lot, the Texas heat pressing against the windows, and pulled out my phone. I had saved the contact information for an attorney named Jose Williams, a specialist in oil and gas law based in Houston. His background caught my attention. He had spent years working for major petroleum companies before switching sides to represent independent landowners. I dialed his number and waited. Jose answered on the third ring, and I spent 20 minutes explaining my situation. He listened without interrupting, asking only occasional clarifying questions. When I finished, there was a long pause before he spoke. He told me I had two options. The first was to send a formal cease and desist letter immediately, asserting my ownership of the mineral rights and demanding that all drilling operations stop. This would start the fight publicly, but it would also give them time to destroy evidence and mobilize legal resources. The second option was to stay silent, let them believe they had won while I quietly gathered financial records, communication logs, and permit applications. Jose explained that every day I waited, they would continue extracting oil from my land, and the social isolation would worsen. But every barrel they extracted was another piece of evidence. Every royalty payment they pocketed was another count of potential fraud. The longer they operated, believing they were safe, the deeper the hole they were digging for themselves. Timing, he said, was the only weapon that mattered in cases like this. I asked him what I should do about the assessment fee. He told me not to pay it, but not to respond to it either. Silence would keep them guessing. Then he told me one more thing. Do not talk to anyone about this. Not neighbors, not old friends of my grandfather, not anyone in the community. Trust no one until the evidence is secured. That evening, I drove past the home of Rosa Delgado, my grandfather's closest neighbor. She was outside watering her garden, a small woman with silver hair and weathered hands that had worked this land almost as long as my grandfather had. I pulled over and stepped out of my car, and she looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. She said I looked like my grandfather, the same stubborn set to my jaw, the same quiet way of watching before speaking. She told me that Walter had also stayed silent when they pressured him. I asked her what she meant. Rosa turned off the water and looked toward the horizon, toward the drilling pad visible in the distance. She said that 3 years ago, Garrett Thornton came to Walter's house and offered to buy his mineral rights. Walter refused. She was in the barn next door and heard Thornton say something before he left, something about finding another way. She did not hear the exact words, but she wrote down the date in her notebook. She always kept notes, she said, a habit from her years as a school teacher. I asked if I could see that notebook. Rosa shook her head slowly. Not yet, she said. When the time was right, she would show me everything. But I needed to be patient, and I needed to be careful. These men had been planning this for a long time. I drove home with her words echoing in my mind, and that night I made a decision. I would be silent, not because I was afraid, but because I had learned that the guilty will reveal themselves if you give them enough rope to hang themselves with. 6 weeks passed. I returned to my life in Dallas during the weekdays, sitting at my desk at the accounting firm, auditing financial statements and tracing transactions as though nothing had changed. But every weekend, I drove the 5 hours back to Midland. I told my coworkers I was settling my grandfather's estate. I told my friends I needed time alone. The truth was simpler and more consuming. I was building a case. Jose Williams had sent me a detailed checklist of documents to gather, and I worked through it methodically, the way I approached every complex fraud investigation. One piece at a time. No assumptions, no shortcuts. The first item on the list was a complete title search, which I commissioned through a title company in Houston that had no connections to Midland County. The results confirmed what I already knew. Walter Hartwell had been the sole owner of the mineral rights since 1962, and there was no record of any transfer, sale, or assignment in the decades since. The second item was the deed history, which I obtained from the county recorder's office during one of my weekend visits. I requested every document associated with my grandfather's property, going back to the original land patent. The clerk recognized me this time and seemed less friendly than before, but she processed my request without comment. The record showed an unbroken chain of ownership. My great-grandfather had homesteaded the land in 1921, passed it to my grandfather in 1958, and my grandfather had held it until his death. No liens, no encumbrances, no mineral rights severances. The third item was more difficult, the incorporation documents for the Permian Ridge Community Association. I found them filed with the Texas Secretary of State, dated 2008. The original service area boundaries were clearly defined, and I compared them against the county's official plat maps. My grandfather's land was not included. It was not even close. The nearest boundary line was more than 2 miles from his property. I spread the maps across my grandfather's desk and studied them side by side. The lease agreement with Apex Petroleum described a service area that included 3,200 acres belonging to the Hartwell estate, but the official HOA incorporation documents showed a service area that stopped well short of that land. Someone had redrawn the boundaries. I called Jose that evening and explained what I had found. He listened carefully, then asked if I had checked the county's zoning records for any boundary adjustments after the original incorporation. I had not. He told me to look for any amendments filed between 2008 and the present, particularly anything approved by the County Planning Commission. The next morning, I was back at the county clerk's office. It took me 4 hours of searching through archived records before I found it. A boundary adjustment request filed in 2014 by the Permian Ridge Community Association, represented by Craig Bellows as legal counsel. The adjustment expanded the HOA's designated service area by approximately 4,000 acres, encompassing several properties that had never been part of the original community, including my grandfather's ranch. The approval signature at the bottom of the document belonged to Garrett Thornton, who had served on the County Planning Commission from 2010 to 2016. He had approved the boundary expansion for an organization he already controlled. The conflict of interest was obvious, but proving that it was deliberate fraud rather than bureaucratic negligence would require more than documents. I needed to show that they knew they were acting without authority and did it anyway. I photographed every page of the zoning records and sent copies to Jose. Then I drafted a Freedom of Information Act request to the Texas Railroad Commission, asking for all permit applications, production reports, and royalty payment records associated with the Apex Petroleum lease on the disputed property. Jose reviewed my request and suggested additional language to ensure the response would include any correspondence between the commission and the parties involved. I mailed the request that afternoon. The estimated response time was 30 to 45 days. More waiting, more silence. That weekend, I visited Rosa Delgado again. She was sitting on her porch when I arrived, a glass of iced tea in her hand and a notebook open on her lap. She had been expecting me, she said. She could tell I was getting close to something. I sat down across from her and asked what she had meant weeks ago when she said my grandfather knew something they did not. Rosa closed her notebook and looked at me for a long moment before speaking. She told me that 2 weeks before Walter died, a man in a dark pickup truck came to visit him. She did not see the man's face clearly, but she saw the logo on the truck, an oil derrick with the letters A and P beneath it, Apex Petroleum. She was working in her garden that afternoon and could hear voices carrying across the dry air. My grandfather rarely raised his voice, she said, but that day he shouted. She heard him say that no one would ever touch a single drop of oil beneath his land, not while he was alive. I asked what happened next. Rosa said the man left shortly after, and Walter stood on his porch watching the truck until it disappeared down the road. 2 weeks later, Walter had a heart attack. He died alone in his kitchen, and by the time Rosa found him the next morning, he had been gone for hours. I sat with that information for a moment, turning it over in my mind. I could not prove any connection between the visit and my grandfather's death, but I could prove that Apex Petroleum had approached him directly, that he had refused them, and that 3 months after his death, they signed a lease with an organization that had no legal authority to represent his interests. The timeline was damning. I asked Rosa if she still had the notebook where she recorded the date of that visit. She nodded slowly and handed it to me. The entry was brief, just a date, a description of the truck, and a single line. Walter, very upset, told the man to leave and never come back. I photographed the page and thanked her. Rosa took my hand before I could stand to leave. She told me to be careful. These men had been planning this for years, she said. They expanded the boundaries. They waited for Walter to die. They moved fast once he was gone. This was not opportunism, it was a strategy. And people who plan that carefully do not give up easily when someone threatens to expose them. I drove back to the ranch as the sun set over the oil fields, the pump jack still moving in its steady rhythm against the darkening sky. I had the documents, I had the timeline, I had a witness. The only question left was when to use them. Jose had told me that timing was the only weapon that mattered. Strike too early and they would have room to maneuver. Strike too late, and they might find a way to bury the evidence. Somewhere between those 2 points was the perfect moment, the moment when the trap would close, and they would have nowhere left to run. I was not there yet, but I was getting closer. 2 months had passed since I began my investigation. I had been careful, visiting the county offices only on weekends, paying cash for document copies, avoiding conversations with anyone who might report back to the HOA. But Midland was a small town, and small towns have long memories and sharp eyes. Someone must have noticed the out-of-state woman who kept requesting records about oil leases and property boundaries. Someone must have talked. Because when the monthly HOA meeting took place on a Tuesday evening in October, I was not invited, but I was very much the topic of discussion. I learned what happened from Rosa, who heard it from a neighbor who had attended. Garrett Thornton had stood before 200 residents and delivered what amounted to a public condemnation. He told them that an outsider was trying to destroy the project that had brought prosperity to their community. He called me a greedy heir who had never lived on the land, never contributed to the town, and only appeared after there was money to be made. Craig Bellows had followed with a more calculated warning. He told the crowd that I was preparing to file a lawsuit against the HOA, and that if I succeeded, all royalty payments would be frozen indefinitely. The families who had been receiving checks every month, money they used for medical bills, college tuition, home repairs, would lose everything because one person refused to accept the will of the community. He urged residents to reach out to me directly and help me understand the consequences of my actions. He framed it as neighborly concern, but I knew what it really was, a coordinated campaign to make my life unbearable until I gave up. The effects were immediate. When I drove into town that weekend, the owner of the hardware store where my grandfather had bought supplies for 40 years told me he was closing early and could not help me. At the gas station, the attendant stared at me with open hostility while I filled my tank. The church where my grandfather had been a member for decades sent me an email, polite but firm, suggesting that my presence at services might cause unnecessary division during this difficult time. But it was what I found at the ranch that broke something inside me. Someone had spray-painted words on the wall of my grandfather's barn. Go back to Dallas. The fence at the entrance had been cut in 3 places, the wire left coiled on the ground like a warning, and on the front porch, placed deliberately where I would see it the moment I arrived, was the body of an orange tabby cat. My grandfather had fed that cat for years, a stray that had wandered onto the property and never left. Someone had shot it and left it there as a message. Now, I want you to pause and really think about this for a moment. This woman inherited land from her grandfather, land that had been in her family for generations. She discovered that people were stealing from her, and when she tried to find the truth, they turned an entire community against her. They vandalized her property. They killed an innocent animal just to send a message, all because she dared to ask questions. This is not just about money or oil rights anymore. This is about how far some people will go to protect their lies. And the real question is, would you have the strength to keep going after something like this? Let us see what Eleanor decided to do. I buried the cat behind the barn, in the shade of an old oak tree where my grandfather used to sit on summer evenings. Then I went inside, locked the doors, and sat in the darkness of the living room, surrounded by photographs of people who were no longer alive to help me. I cried for the first time since the funeral, not just for the cat or for my grandfather, but for the weight of fighting alone against people who seemed to have unlimited power to make me suffer. I called my mother that night. She lived in Florida now, remarried to a man I barely knew, and we spoke maybe twice a year. She listened as I told her what had been happening, the documents, the threats, the isolation. When I finished, she sighed heavily and told me to stop. Just stop, she said. Sell the land, take whatever money they offered and walk away. Life was too short to spend it fighting battles that could not be won. I told her this was not about money. It was about what was right. She laughed bitterly and said I sounded exactly like my father, and my grandfather before him. Stubborn men who held on to principles until those principles destroyed them. Neither of them died happy, she said. Neither of them knew when to let go. The call ended in silence, and I sat alone in my grandfather's chair, staring at my reflection in the dark window. I asked myself a question I had been avoiding for weeks. If no one believed me, if the entire community had decided I was the enemy, did the truth even matter anymore? I did not have an answer. But the next morning, my phone rang, and everything changed. It was Jose Williams, and his voice had an edge I had not heard before. The FOIA response had arrived, he said. He had been reviewing the documents all night, and what he found was worse than we expected. According to the production reports from the Texas Railroad Commission, Apex Petroleum had extracted over 98,000 barrels of oil from the disputed property in the past 8 months. At current prices, the royalty payments totaled approximately $2.3 million. Those payments had been deposited into the Permian Ridge Community Association's operating account, exactly as the lease agreement specified, but the money had not stayed there. Jose had traced the transfers. Within days of each deposit, roughly half the funds, over $1.1 million, had been transferred to personal accounts belonging to Garrett Thornton and Craig Bellows. The rest remained in the HOA account, but was categorized as management fees and legal expenses, with no invoices or documentation to support the charges. This was not just fraud, Jose said. This was embezzlement. And because the money had moved through federally regulated banks, crossing state lines in the process, it potentially constituted federal wire fraud, a crime that carried sentences of up to 20 years. He asked me if I wanted to stop. He said no one would blame me if I did. The personal cost had already been enormous, and it would only get worse before it got better. I looked out the window at the drilling pad in the distance, still pumping oil from land that belonged to me. I thought about the cat buried behind the barn. I thought about my grandfather shouting at a man in a dark truck, 2 weeks before his heart gave out. I told Jose I was not stopping. I told him to send me everything. Then I opened my laptop and began to read. I am Michael Vincent, your storyteller today on the HOA Fallout channel. And if you were in this situation, the entire community turned against you, threatened, isolated, with everything you have worked for on the line, what would you do? Keep fighting or walk away? Drop your answer in the comments below and let us see whose solution is the best. Thank you all for being here. I spent 2 weeks in my Dallas apartment doing what I did best, following the money. The FOIA documents spread across my kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle, and I worked through them the same way I approached every complex fraud case at the firm, one transaction at a time. No assumptions, no shortcuts. The production reports from the Texas Railroad Commission showed exactly how much oil had been extracted each month, and the royalty statements from Apex Petroleum confirmed the payments. 8% of gross production, deposited monthly into the Permian Ridge Community Association's operating account at First National Bank of Midland. The numbers matched perfectly, but that was where the clean trail ended. I pulled the bank statements Jose had obtained through discovery requests and began mapping the outflows. Within 72 hours of each royalty deposit, large transfers appeared, round numbers, always just under the reporting threshold that would trigger automatic federal review. Half went to an account in Garrett Thornton's name at a bank in Odessa. Half went to Craig Bellows at a bank in Lubbock. The remaining funds stayed in the HOA account, labeled as administrative expenses, but there were no invoices, no vendor payments, no documentation of any kind. I created a spreadsheet tracking every dollar from wellhead to wallet. The pattern was undeniable. Over 8 months, Apex Petroleum had paid $2.3 million in royalties for oil, extracted from land they believed was properly leased. The HOA had received every penny, and Garrett Thornton and Craig Bellows had personally pocketed over $1.1 million, while the rest disappeared into phantom expenses. I photographed the spreadsheet and sent it to Jose along with my analysis. His response came within an hour. He had already forwarded everything to a contact at the FBI's Houston field office. 2 days later, I received a call from Special Agent Dana Thomas. She introduced herself calmly and professionally, explaining that the Bureau had opened a preliminary investigation based on the financial evidence. She asked if I would be willing to meet in person to discuss the case. I drove to Houston that weekend. Agent Thomas was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of the senior partners at my firm. She had already reviewed the documents and understood the basic structure of the fraud, but she explained that proving criminal intent required more than financial records. We could show that money had moved from point A to point B. We could show that the lease agreement was signed by people who had no legal authority to sign it. But to secure federal charges, we needed to prove that Garrett and Craig knew they were acting without authority, that this was deliberate fraud, not a bureaucratic mistake or a good-faith misunderstanding of property law. I told her about the boundary adjustment in 2014, approved by Garrett while he sat on the County Planning Commission. I told her about the HOA and corporation documents that clearly excluded my grandfather's land. She nodded and took notes, but I could see she wanted something more concrete, a document, a recording, a witness who could testify to their intent. I thought about Rosa Delgado and the notebook she had mentioned, the one where she recorded the date of Garrett's visit to my grandfather 3 years before his death. I had not pushed her for it, respecting her request to wait until the time was right. But now the time had come. I drove back to Midland that evening and knocked on Rosa's door the next morning. She invited me in for coffee, and we sat at her kitchen table while the sun rose over the oil fields in the distance. I told her everything: the financial trail, the FBI investigation, the need to prove that Garrett had known all along that he had no right to my grandfather's minerals. Rosa listened without interrupting, her weathered hands wrapped around her coffee cup. When I finished, she stood slowly and walked to a cabinet in her living room. She returned with a worn leather notebook, the kind school teachers used to keep decades ago. She opened it to a page dated 3 years earlier and handed it to me. Her handwriting was precise and careful. The entry described a summer afternoon when she had been working in her garden and heard voices from my grandfather's property. Garrett Thornton had come to visit, she wrote, driving a white truck with the HOA logo on the door. The conversation had grown heated. She could not hear every word, but she heard my grandfather's voice rise in anger, something that rarely happened, and she heard Garrett's response as he walked back to his truck. The words were written in quotation marks, underlined twice. "We will find another way, Walter. One way or another, that oil is coming out of the ground." I stared at the page for a long moment. This was not just evidence of intent. This was evidence of premeditation. 3 years before the lease was signed, Garrett Thornton had told my grandfather directly that he would find a way to take what he wanted. And 3 months after my grandfather died, he did exactly that. I photographed every page of the notebook and asked Rosa if she would be willing to testify. She hesitated, and I understood why. She had lived in this community her entire life. Speaking against Garrett Thornton would make her a target, just as it had made me one. But she looked at the photograph of my grandfather on her mantle, a picture from a church picnic years ago, the two of them standing side by side, and nodded slowly. Walter had been her friend, she said. He had helped her when her husband died, had fixed her fence, and checked on her during storms. She owed him the truth. I thanked her and drove back to the ranch with the evidence secured on my phone. That night, I called Jose and told him what I had found. He was quiet for a moment, then asked when the HOA's annual meeting was scheduled. I checked the community newsletter that had been stuffed in my mailbox weeks ago. 2 weeks from Saturday, at the Midland Community Center. Jose said that was our moment. Public venue, witnesses present, possibly press if we tipped them off. I asked him if we were ready. He said we had the money trail, the forged boundaries, and now a witness to premeditation. The only thing left was to see how they reacted when the trap closed around them. 1 week before the HOA's annual meeting, I drove to Houston to meet Jose Williams at his office. We had been working together for months now, but this was the first time we sat face to face across a conference table with every piece of evidence laid out between us. The documents covered the entire surface: deed records, boundary maps, bank statements, production reports, and Rosa's notebook pages. Jose studied them in silence for several minutes, then looked up at me with an expression that was equal parts admiration and concern. He said we had 3 options. The first was to send a cease and desist letter immediately, demanding that Apex Petroleum halt all operations and that the HOA return every dollar of royalty payments. This would start the legal battle publicly, but it would give Garrett and Craig time to hire expensive attorneys, destroy evidence, and spin the narrative in their favor. The second option was to file a lawsuit directly, seeking injunctive relief and damages. This would be slower, more expensive, and would likely drag on for years in civil court. The third option was the one Jose recommended: a public reveal at the annual meeting, in front of the entire community, with press present and representatives from the Texas Railroad Commission in attendance. He explained his reasoning carefully. In a civil lawsuit, the burden of proof was on us to demonstrate harm, but in a public forum, the burden shifted. We would present the evidence, ask questions, and let Garrett and Craig respond. Their reactions, their denials, their evasions, their attempts to deflect would become part of the record. And if they lied in front of witnesses and regulatory officials, those lies would compound their legal exposure. Jose called it strategic transparency. I called it giving them enough rope to hang themselves. I told him I agreed with option 3. He nodded and pulled out a legal pad. We spent the next 4 hours preparing what he called the presentation package, a carefully sequenced set of documents designed to build the case piece by piece, each revelation leading naturally to the next. The deed proving my grandfather retained mineral rights. The original HOA boundaries excluded his land. The 2014 adjustment that Garrett approved while sitting on the Planning Commission. The lease agreement was signed without authority. The bank records show money flowing into personal accounts. And finally, Rosa's testimony about Garrett's threat 3 years before my grandfather died. Jose had already contacted reporters at the Midland Reporter-Telegram and the Houston Chronicle, tipping them off that something significant would happen at the meeting. He did not provide details, only that a major fraud case involving oil rights and HOA misconduct would be revealed. Both papers confirmed they would send journalists. He had also filed a formal complaint with the Texas Railroad Commission, requesting that a representative attend the meeting to address potential violations of drilling permit regulations. The commission confirmed they would send an inspector. Everything was falling into place. But 3 days before the meeting, my phone rang with a call that changed everything. It was Special Agent Dana Thomas from the FBI. Her voice was calm but urgent. She asked if I could speak privately. I stepped onto the balcony of my apartment and told her I was alone. She said the Bureau had made a significant discovery during its investigation. When Apex Petroleum signed the lease agreement with the HOA, they required a standard affidavit, a sworn statement certifying that the association had legal authority to act on behalf of all landowners within the described boundaries. That affidavit had been signed by Craig Bellows and notarized by a clerk at his law office. But attached to the affidavit was a separate document, a letter purportedly signed by Walter Hartwell, authorizing the Permian Ridge Community Association to negotiate mineral rights on his behalf. Agent Thomas had obtained a copy of that letter and compared the signature to verified samples of my grandfather's handwriting from his bank records, his driver's license renewal, and his last will. The signatures did not match. The letter was a forgery. I stood on the balcony, the Houston skyline glittering in the distance, and felt the ground shift beneath me. This was not just fraud anymore. This was not just embezzlement. Craig Bellows had forged my grandfather's signature on a federal document, a document used to secure millions of dollars in oil extraction rights. Forgery of this nature was a federal felony, carrying up to 15 years in prison. Agent Thomas explained that the FBI was now treating this as a criminal case, not just a civil matter. But she asked me for something important. She asked me not to mention the forgery at the public meeting. The Bureau needed time to build its case properly to ensure that when they made arrests, the charges would stick. If I revealed the forgery publicly, Garrett and Craig might have time to flee, destroy additional evidence, or coordinate their stories. She wanted me to present everything else. The boundary manipulation, the unauthorized lease, the embezzlement, but to hold back the smoking gun until the FBI was ready to act. I understood her reasoning, but it felt like being asked to fight with one hand tied behind my back. The forgery was the most damning piece of evidence we had. It proved beyond any doubt that they knew they had no authority, because if they had believed the lease was legitimate, they would not have needed to fake my grandfather's consent. But I also understood that timing mattered. If I revealed too much too soon, they might escape the consequences entirely. I told Agent Thomas I would hold back the forgery. She thanked me and promised to keep me informed of the investigation's progress. I hung up and stood in silence for a long moment, watching the city lights flicker below. Then I called Jose and told him about the conversation. He was quiet for several seconds before responding. He said we still had more than enough to destroy their credibility at the meeting. The forgery would be the final nail in the coffin, but we did not need it to open the grave. They forged a dead man's signature to steal his legacy. Let that sink in for a moment. This was not a misunderstanding or a technicality. This was a calculated crime against someone who could no longer defend himself, and his granddaughter was about to make them answer for it. The night before the meeting, I stood in my grandfather's office, practicing what I would say. Not accusations, not anger, just questions and documents, delivered calmly, letting the evidence speak for itself. I looked at his photograph on the wall, a younger version of the man I remembered, standing proudly on the land his father had homesteaded. I made him one last promise, Tomorrow, the truth would come out, and they would have nowhere left to hide. The Midland Community Center was built in the 1970s, a low brick building with fluorescent lights and folding chairs that had hosted decades of town meetings, wedding receptions, and church potlucks. On the second Saturday of November, it held the largest HOA gathering in the association's history. Over 250 residents filled the main hall, their voices creating a low hum of anticipation that I could hear from the parking lot. I arrived early with Rosa Delgado, and we took seats in the back row, near the emergency exit. Jose Williams stood by the main entrance, his briefcase containing copies of every document we had assembled. Near the refreshment table, I spotted two people with press badges, one from the Midland Reporter-Telegram, one from the Houston Chronicle. And in the corner, a man in a gray suit sat alone with a notepad. I recognized the seal on his lapel. Texas Railroad Commission. Everyone was in position. The trap was set. At exactly 7 o'clock, Garrett Thornton walked to the podium at the front of the room. He wore his usual Western-style shirt, freshly pressed, and his silver hair gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Craig Bellows sat at the head table beside him, along with 3 other board members who looked considerably less comfortable. Garrett tapped the microphone twice and welcomed everyone with the ease of a man who had controlled these meetings for over a decade. He began with the financial report, his voice warm and confident. He spoke about the tremendous success of the oil partnership with Apex Petroleum, about the royalty payments that had benefited the entire community, about the new road improvements and the scholarship fund, and the senior assistance program. He painted a picture of prosperity and progress, of a community united under wise leadership. When he finished, there was applause. Not thunderous, but genuine. These people believed him. They had no reason to. Garrett smiled and opened the floor for questions. Several hands went up, and he called on familiar faces first. Softball questions about next year's budget, about the holiday decoration schedule, about parking lot maintenance. He answered each one with practiced charm, occasionally making small jokes that drew polite laughter. After 15 minutes, the questions began to thin out. Garrett scanned the room, looking for any remaining hands. That was when I stood up. The room fell quiet as people turned to look at me. I could feel the weight of their stares. Some curious, some hostile, some simply confused. Garrett's smile flickered for just a moment before he recovered. He said my name as though greeting an old friend. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "how nice of you to join us. Did you have a question?" I walked slowly down the center aisle, my laptop tucked under my arm. I stopped about 10 feet from the podium and spoke clearly, projecting my voice so that everyone in the room could hear. I said I had several questions, actually, and I hoped he would not mind if I used visual aids. Before he could respond, I turned to the projection screen on the wall and connected my laptop to the community center's system. The first image appeared, a side-by-side comparison of 2 maps. I explained that the map on the left showed the original HOA service boundaries filed with the Texas Secretary of State in 2008. The map on the right showed the boundaries described in the Apex Petroleum lease agreement. I pointed to the 3,200 acres in the northeast corner that appeared on one map but not the other. Then I asked Garrett to explain how my grandfather's land came to be included in the lease when it was never part of the original HOA service area. The room was silent. Garrett's smile had vanished. He cleared his throat and said something about a boundary adjustment that had been properly approved years ago. I clicked to the next slide, the 2014 adjustment request, with his signature at the bottom as a member of the County Planning Commission. I asked him if he saw any conflict of interest in approving a boundary expansion for an organization he controlled. Craig Bellows leaned forward and interrupted. He said these were complex legal matters that could not be properly addressed in a public forum. He suggested I file a formal inquiry through proper channels. I ignored him and clicked to the next slide, the bank records showing transfers from the HOA account to personal accounts in Garrett's name and Craig's name, over $1.1 million in 8 months. I asked if either of them would like to explain what services they had provided to justify those payments. Garrett's face turned red. He gripped the podium with both hands and raised his voice. "This is defamation," he said. "These are lies and distortions designed to destroy everything we have built. You have no right to come into our community and make these accusations." I remained calm. I said I was not making accusations. I was asking questions and presenting documents. The documents spoke for themselves. The man from the Texas Railroad Commission stood up and introduced himself. He said the commission had received a complaint regarding the permit applications for the Apex Petroleum drilling operation. The applications listed the Permian Ridge HOA as the authorized representative of all landowners within the lease boundaries. He asked Garrett if he could provide documentation, proving authorization for the Hartwell property. Garrett opened his mouth, but no words came out. Craig Bellows stood abruptly and said the meeting was adjourned. He grabbed Garrett's arm and tried to guide him toward the side door. But the reporters were already moving, calling out questions. One asked about the embezzlement allegations. Another asked if they had any comment on the federal investigation. The room erupted in chaos, residents shouting, board members looking bewildered, Garrett standing frozen as cameras flashed. I walked back to my seat beside Rosa, who took my hand and squeezed it gently. She whispered that my grandfather would have been proud. I watched Garrett and Craig disappear through the side exit, their reputations crumbling with every step. The community that had shunned me for months now stared at the empty podium, their certainty shattered. I had not raised my voice. I had not made accusations. I had simply asked questions and let the evidence speak. And when cornered, Garrett Thornton had done exactly what guilty men always do. He had revealed himself through his own desperate reaction. The trap had closed, but the legal consequences were only beginning. 6 weeks after the meeting, the consequences arrived. FBI agents arrested Craig Bellows at his law office on a Tuesday morning, charging him with forgery of federal documents, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The forged letter bearing my grandfather's signature became the centerpiece of the federal case. Garrett Thornton was arrested the same day at his home, charged with embezzlement and conspiracy. Both men posted bail and were placed under house arrest pending trial. Their photographs appeared on the front page of the Midland Reporter-Telegram, and within days, the story had spread to major outlets across Texas. Apex Petroleum immediately suspended all drilling operations and reached out to Jose Williams to discuss settlement options. The oil company had been deceived just as I had been. They had signed a lease in good faith, believing the HOA had proper authority. Now, they faced the prospect of having extracted millions of dollars worth of oil from land they had no legal right to touch. The community reacted with confusion and anger, but not at me. The residents who had shunned me, who had called me greedy and selfish, who had spray-painted my grandfather's barn and killed his cat, now found themselves confronting an uncomfortable truth. They had been lied to. The money they had received from the royalty payments had come from stolen resources. Rumors spread that I was planning to sue every family that had benefited from the fraud. Jose received dozens of calls from panicked residents asking if they needed lawyers. The fear was palpable, and I understood it. These people were not criminals. They were ordinary families who had trusted their leadership and been betrayed. Jose laid out my options during a phone call one evening. I could pursue maximum damages against everyone involved: Apex Petroleum, the HOA, and potentially every resident who had received royalty payments from the illegal lease. If I pursued that route, I would be wealthy, and the community that had turned against me would be devastated. I told Jose my decision. I would sue Apex Petroleum for full recovery of all royalties plus damages for unauthorized extraction. The oil company had deep pockets. They could afford to pay. But I would not pursue claims against individual residents. The families who had received distributions in good faith would not be asked to return the money. Instead, once the settlement was finalized, I would negotiate a new lease with Apex. Proper authorization, fair terms, transparent accounting. A portion of my royalty income would be directed to a community trust fund, managed by an independent board with no connection to the former HOA leadership. The fund would support the same programs Garrett had claimed to champion, but without the corruption that had poisoned everything he touched. Jose asked if I was sure. I told him I was. The settlement was finalized 3 months later. Apex agreed to pay damages and back royalties, plus legal fees. The new lease guaranteed me a significantly better percentage than the HOA had negotiated while skimming for themselves. Craig Bellows pleaded guilty to federal forgery charges and received 5 years in prison. Garrett Thornton was convicted of embezzlement and conspiracy, sentenced to 3 years with mandatory restitution. I watched the sentencing from the back of the courtroom, feeling nothing like triumph, only exhaustion and a quiet sense of closure. The week after the trial ended, I drove back to Midland one last time. I stopped at Rosa's house first. She was waiting on her porch with 2 glasses of iced tea. We sat together in silence, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and gold. She told me I had done the right thing. Not the easy thing, but the right thing. My grandfather would have been proud. Before I left town, I visited the cemetery where Walter Hartwell was buried. I knelt beside his headstone and placed a single wildflower on the grave. I did not say anything. There was nothing left to say. He had taught me that land was more than dirt and minerals. It was a promise to the generations that came after. I had kept that promise, and now it was time to go home. I drove away as the stars began to appear, the pump jack on the horizon finally still and silent. Some victories do not come with celebration. They come with the quiet knowledge that you did not become the thing you were fighting against. Every story has a lesson hidden somewhere inside it. Eleanor Hartwell did not win because she was louder or more ruthless than her enemies. She won because she stayed patient when others would have exploded, asked questions when others would have made accusations, and chose restraint when she finally had the power to destroy. Fighting fire with fire is easy. Fighting fire with integrity and still coming out whole is something else entirely. So if you ever find yourself facing people who want to take what is yours, remember this. Stay calm, build your case, and when the moment comes, do not let them turn you into a version of yourself you would not recognize.